I was about to go sign my contract with Bear Stearns, and I broke down in the subway station and realized this is not me. And I got on another train and didn't know where I was going and didn't do it. So that's kind of a culmination of me following something, an inner knowing that I didn't know where I was going, which is hard to do for a lot of people. It was hard to do for me. It was a crisis at the time.
Welcome to Entrepreneurs Recovery. I am so glad you are here today. Really grateful for today's guests that I'm going to mention in a second. In the meantime, just a little check-in. How are you doing? Thank you so much for liking and subscribing to the show on YouTube and leaving a review on Spotify, iTunes. This helps people to reach the show, and the show continues to grow. Slowly but surely, we grow. We attract more guests that I really am excited about interviewing. And it's always a great sign when a lot of the guests are asking me to come on the show, guests that I have written down that I said, oh, I'd really like to interview this person, and then they reach out. So it's been quite a gift. So thank you all for your support. Thank you all for your feedback. And, don't be shy, reach out. Any feedback you have for me, maybe there's a guest that you want me to interview, or there's a topic you'd like me to get into, please reach out. I've had people do that. It's really, really helpful to hear all the feedback, good or bad, negative or positive. All of it is really constructive. So today's guest is Keith Kurlander, and Keith is the founder of the Integrative Psychiatry Institute. This is a leading training in the world for integrative mental health and psychedelic trainings. I found them many years ago, and I was thinking about doing their training, and I have been following them ever since, and they've continued to grow and expand. And, what I love about today's episode is Keith's story. He is walking the walk. He has gone through incredible challenges, and he is a living testament to his trainings that he offers. He lives a lot. He lives what he teaches and what his company offers, which his company is growing at a very rapid rate. So today is just another one of those incredible conversations with someone who has just done so much on his own and so much in the space of mental health, so much in the space of psychedelics and psychedelic training. So I really, really hope you enjoy this episode. It is one that we went down some paths of questions that I've always wanted to ask and got to ask. So really hope you enjoy the show, and hope you have an amazing day. Hey, Keith, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited for this episode for many reasons. One of the biggest reasons is because this is the first time we've ever met, but I certainly have heard of your organization through a gentleman named Jamie Davila. And so I know he's the director of psychedelic trainings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he directs all the psychedelic training. Yeah.
Yeah. So what's interesting?
Yeah, he's great.
I reached out to him years ago about your training. And for those that don't know, you guys have a pretty robust training in the industry. And when I dived into psychedelics, I said, I want to get a good training, a good certification. You were the first company I reached out to, and I talked to Jamie. And this is before he became the director of trainings. And we've stayed connected. We've stayed friends. And now here we are. I'm interviewing.
That's so cool.
Yeah, his boss. And so I just think it's a small world. And so for those of you that are listening, we're going to dive into a lot of things, but I think one of the things to pay attention to is the trainings you guys have in psychedelic-assisted therapy, because from my research, you guys are the premier. You guys are doing it in a really major way, especially if you're a mental health counselor or doctor, psychologist, to check out the trainings. But it's for all different types of people, integrative mental health, even nutritional trainings, which I appreciated to see. So with that said, welcome to the show. It's really nice to meet you, Keith.
Thanks.
Glad you're here.
Yeah.
What I like to do with all my guests is I'd really love to hear about your story. I know you lived through quite a bit, and this podcast is called Entrepreneurs in Recovery for a reason. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your backstory, what you went through, and then we can get into who you are today.
Great. Just interrupt me if I go too long. So I'm an entrepreneur now, and before this, I could say a solopreneur. I had an independent private practice of just me, and then before that, I'll start my story. So I graduated college, and I was really good at math and numbers, and I had an accounting degree. I thought I was going to be pre-med. I didn't do it because I didn't have the mental or emotional discipline when I was younger to deal with science classes to the degree that I would have needed to. So anyways, went down this other road that was more natural to me. And then I graduated college, and I faced a big crossroads, which was I got contracted for a 3-year contract at Bear Stearns, which went down in 2008 as one of the few firms that didn't make it through 2008. And they were, at the time, they were the second largest brokerage firm in the world. And they had hired me to spearhead a interdepartmental task force among the top 10 brokerage firms on Wall Street to deal with the Y2K problem. Because the summer before I interned, and I found all this money. They were switching computer systems they were updating, and I found a bunch of money they were losing because there was a rounding error in their old system. Anyways, I was good at this kind of thing. But I was facing a major crossroads, which was my heart, my soul was like, I'm not really this guy. I'm something else. I don't know what I am. I'm not this. And it felt sort of like a conventional path that wasn't me. So to collapse the story, I took a train under the World Trade Center subway station at the time, which was still there. And I was about to go sign my contract with Bear Stearns, and I broke down in the subway station and realized this is not me. And I got on another train and didn't know where I was going and didn't do it. That then so that's kind of a culmination of me following something, an inner knowing that I didn't know where I was going, which is hard to do for a lot of people. It was hard to do for me. It was a crisis at the time. Anyways, that led me down a path where at first I became a massage therapist. Then I became a yoga instructor. Then I went to school for counseling. Now, alongside all of this, I was dealing with waves and bouts of pretty severe mental illness, kind of a wide variety of things. I wasn't well, is the best way to say it. And so that's happening alongside this sort of discovery of purpose. I ended up then discovering I wanted to study counseling. And I went to Naropa. They had a transpersonal counseling program. And I studied counseling, and it was great. And I started healing myself, but I was still kind of struggling with mental health issues a lot. Everything. I mean, I've been diagnosed with kind of a soft bipolar disorder, OCD type symptoms. I was diagnosed with severe anxiety, depression, and then all these dissociation disorders like depersonalization. Anyways, very uncomfortable. I was sick. I had chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia. Like I was kind of a mess. So alongside it, it became this like it became a professional pursuit to solve my personal issues and help people along the way. And it started a very spiritual kind of journey in that. And like it was yoga and Eastern traditions. And then I kind of went down the psychology thing and the psychotherapy. So that was all going on. And then alongside of that was psychedelics here and there, of trying to use them to both open my mind, but heal something that I didn't know what it was. I felt different. And then in my 30s, this is my 20s, in my 30s, I was in the heart of my counseling practice. And again, bouts of issues. I was in an ayahuasca community that for me, it was always like, I always felt different. Like I couldn't tell if it was making me worse or better. Always. It seemed like it was making me worse. And so, but at the time it was still, this is 15 plus years ago, it just wasn't, the consciousness wasn't as mainstream yet around psychedelic therapy. Fast forward, I then launched my first, outside of solopreneurship, I launched my first business called Higher Practice, where I was training people how to grow their practices. And then I then co-founded after that 7 years ago, the Integrative Psychiatry Institute, which is what you began talking about with Will Vanderveer, who's a close friend of mine. Healed a lot of my mental health issues along the way. I'm not on medications anymore. We have a very successful organization that we co-founded. It's definitely the largest psychotherapy training. It was successful in the sense of top 100 fastest growing companies in Inc. So there was, it's like my story was like, I was able to overcome a lot through a lot of things. Psychedelics was a part of that. And trying to give back some of the knowledge that I learned along the way. So I'll pause there.
Yeah.
That was a lot, but
yeah, that was a lot, but that's okay, because I want to get into a lot of things with you. And I think your backstory is really important, going through severe mental health challenges. I feel a lot of similarities to you. I started my company 7 years ago. I left a Fortune 20 company to do so at the top of my game, because I was in a daily depression. I landed my dream job and I was in a daily depression. And so I feel that connection. And then, and I think that could be a more common story than what we know. I think the fact that you followed your inner knowing and the way it turned out is exceptional. And I think that there's a lot of stories of that that we don't hear. But I'm particularly interested in your story, because your story is one of going through actual mental health disorders, if we're going to call them disorders, challenges. And from what I can pick up is listening to an episode you did with your co-host, Dr. Will, you had this episode about your experiences with ketamine-assisted therapy. So I'm really, really want to get into this, because this is something that is, especially me living in Costa Rica, talking about synthetic medicines doesn't go over too well. And I'm curious about your experience with that medicine and how that helped you.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So my experience with ketamine-assisted therapy was great, because it was one of the first, I would say, really structured therapy experiences I had with psychedelics. And it was very healing overall. Like most of my experience on psychedelics prior to that it was very jarring and very disturbing. But leading into that, even though it was jarring and disturbing, it was always amplifying a lot of trauma in my system. And I just didn't understand it because it just looked weird and felt weird. And the outcomes were always intense. But the ketamine session was really a healing, because the experience itself was incredibly smooth for me. I mean, it was a big experience, but it wasn't as scary to my prior experiences. But there was also kind of a wrapping up of some pieces, some chapters of my trauma in that session that I hadn't touched before. And I could get into the specifics, but it was really useful for me in that way, where it helped me wrap up some trauma. And we don't usually think about ketamine therapy or we don't usually talk about it, I should say, as, a trauma tool. It's usually talked about as a depression tool. But that kind of goes into a much larger discussion of trauma being beneath most, if not all, mental health issues.
Yeah, for sure. And addiction, especially. So, so I'm curious. I mean, I'm not talking to just any person right now. I'm talking to someone who not only has his own clinic that, offers ketamine-assisted therapy to patients. You have trainings that fall under this umbrella that are quite robust. And so, but you also have a personal experience, which I think is essential. And what I'm seeing a lot in the industry is many people are coming in, well-intentioned people, starting ketamine clinics, but not having the background, not having the experience, not have tried ketamine, and especially have not tried psychedelics. Because there's one thing to say, okay, I've done ketamine-assisted therapy. There's another thing when you have done psychedelics, especially large psychedelics like ayahuasca, 5-MeO DMT, even peyote, very large experiences. If you go into a ketamine-assisted therapy session, you could actually have a cross where the medicine of 5-MeO or even a high psilocybin experience can come into the ketamine experience, which I've had. I've had intramuscular ketamine, a higher dose, and all of a sudden I'm in the 5-MeO DMT journey, and it was very intense. And unfortunately, the person who's serving me could not relate, has never done 5-MeO, had only done really small levels of ketamine. So, what is your experience with that, and how important is it for practitioners to have the training and experience themselves of a medicine like ketamine before they serve?
We encourage that people have the experience. We don't require it. It's kind of like, you said recovery. It's like somebody working in recovery that was never an addict.
Mm-hmm.
It happens, there's tons of counselors out there that work with addictions to some degree who didn't go through a recovery process, but there's something unique about going through the process too, right? So there's something that's hard to relate to without it. So I think it's extremely useful to have an experience. Do you have to have an experience with every single medicine? I don't think so. But I think you do need to, not need, but I think it's highly useful to have had an experience. And most people drawn to the work, want to have an experience if they're going to be holding space for people.
Yeah, and I know this is true because my first therapist that was court appointed when I was 22 years old, that I had for 9 years as a therapist, was never an alcoholic, would never had problems with drugs. And she held more space than most humans. In fact, I became a clinical mental health counselor because of the way she held space with no experience with that type of addiction. So I know
Right.
that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I am curious, so what that experience you had with ketamine-assisted therapy, what would you say it actually did for you as a business owner, a solopreneur, which you became obviously a team of people, but what did it do for you as an entrepreneur, as a person? Was it like a game-changing experience, or was it just something that was similar to other psychedelic experiences you've had?
Well, to answer that, I'll just say that generally speaking, what happens to me on psychedelic is it amplifies the traumatic patterns that my nervous system can default to. So a lot of vigilance, a lot of agitation, overwhelm, a lot of panic. And then my mind follows along with a lot of chaotic, disorganized thinking and tons of visuals, and I get very in the ethereal space. And so it's sort of like, it typically doesn't matter how much I take or what I take. And I actually haven't done many psychedelics in the last 10 years. I did a lot of psychedelics prior to that. The ketamine, so normally I get an amplification of trauma, and it's very hard for me to actually work through it. It's a little too strong, the trauma experience. However, this was prior to what we're talking about. So it was either in an ayahuasca church, or in my 20s, it was in, uncontrolled settings completely, not even in ceremony. But in the ayahuasca church, like it wasn't therapy, it was ceremony. The ketamine therapy session was different in that I had already done so much work on myself at that point. in terms of like really working through a lot of this stuff. And the ketamine session, the piece that came out of that one session, and every session's different, obviously, but the piece that came out of that one session was more of a intergenerational trauma piece. I'm Jewish, and there's a lot of Holocaust imprints in my psychology, my nervous, my body, for whatever reason. I mean, I had some indirect descendants there. So it was a healing around that. There was kind of a closing of a chapter there for me of being like, I think I can move on some level from this. And there was sort of a healing with that ancestral piece in a different way that I'd never had before that. And that was a big deal in terms of you're asking like, well, what does that look like going forward? It looked like almost focusing a little less on me is what it looked like going forward. That was a big change. I didn't have to focus as much on my inner landscape. Didn't overtake me as much.
Yeah. And the reason why I'm kind of opening up and going here right away is because I can relate a lot to it. You talked about waking up parts of your childhood, and that's what happened to me. And I had tried many other psychedelics, and not just psychedelic recreation. I mean, with guides for 8 hours at a time, like incredible care, incredible space hold, incredible containers that a lot of people don't get. They don't really exist that much. We still have laws that are creating those barriers from people to meeting a lot of these medicines, but I've had the privilege of doing them and under these types of incredible space holders and guides. But there's one thing about ketamine that stood out was there were stories that I had of childhood memories, and I was able to work through them at certain dose with the right guide to go through those stories and unravel them in crystal clarity. Like it's almost like parts of my mind unlocked I couldn't access, and I could see the stories and then literally cry them out. I cried them out loud. I could see the truth and just started wailing. And I realized, wow, I couldn't do that with traditional psychotherapy for almost 15 years. And a lot of the things I was doing, it couldn't get to that place, even with the other medicines, the other psychedelic medicines. So I just wanted to kind of go there. I know you've had these experiences, and I know you have a clinic that serves this medicine. And so it's a really interesting discussion about utilizing this medicine at the right dose with a guide. And I also had done a lot of work on myself before I got to this ketamine-assisted therapy. So I think I was ready for that, maybe to see that. And that's what came. Other than that, I would just say maybe it's unique to that medicine. I don't really know. But when it came, the story unraveled, the pieces unfolded. And the pieces that unfolded, it wasn't just, oh, wow, I'm so glad I went through that. Like I ended up reaching out to a childhood friend. I ended up confirming the story, which added another layer of emotional memories and crying. So that's where I wanted to go there. I know that, with your background with severe mental health and then becoming who you are and then utilizing this medicine, it's not being talked about. I mean, I have a show like you have an incredible podcast, and I just don't hear enough stories of this. And I really want to make sure that people understand that there's risks, inherent risks, of course, but with the right guide, the right dose, there can be some incredible breakthroughs with the brain, with the trauma stories, the trauma narratives. And so that's why.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. Thanks for sharing all that. It's incredible. I mean, there's a lot of people like you that, they regress into childhood experiences on these medicines and just can see them and remember them in a different way with a different vantage point and detach from the story enough to understand it and let go of the parts that aren't serving you, so it's amazing. That's obviously the amazing side of psychedelics and psychedelic therapies, but there's obviously risk, like you said. I mean, it doesn't go that way for everybody.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we need more stories, of course, more information. We're not going to get it on the news, but we can get it on formats like this or YouTube. And So it's really excited to have you here to have this discussion. I'm curious about your training. So let's talk about your trainings. And the piece of psychedelic-assisted therapy certification is essential, really important. And obviously we have a lot of legality issues with psychedelics. But you guys seem to still push forward despite the legal landscape of training people in these fields. So how does that work? How do you navigate trainings where we still have a lot of legal issues?
It's not simple. I think it requires, I would say on the first level, it was fortunate, and a strange outcome of COVID was that some teletherapy laws changed for temporarily, but who knows, it might be permanent, around the prescribing of controlled substances. So there's positives and negatives to that, obviously, and that's going to be a long-standing conversation. But what that allowed for with ketamine was that more people were able to get it who needed it. And and because of that, what has happened is a lot of patients are able to get ketamine that actually need it, typically for depression, and they can self-administer in a therapist's office. And the therapist can do the therapy, and the patient self-administers, and sometimes there's some medical oversight, depending on the teletherapy that they get it from. So that was sort of a major change in terms of regulations and access to this stuff, because ketamine therapy is expensive in general. Like if you go to IV ketamine clinic, it's very expensive. You're paying $3,000, $5,000, $7,000 for the full course of treatment if you do IV therapy, which IV therapy has the most studies outside of the one FDA medication that was approved a handful of years ago. With all that said, the regulations on the other medicines is a whole different issue. Psilocybin we have now in Oregon, and it'll be to market in Colorado within a couple months. But that's, it's a Schedule 1 substance still. So we don't have access to that legally. And our institute, my whole thing is just, I want to train the therapists that are going to bring this forward, and the medical providers. So we're only in the legal landscape. So we don't really have that. Same thing with MDMA, that got rejected, right? So in August. So we hope to see both of these medicines, psilocybin and MDMA, we hope to see them in 2027, 2028, get an approval. And with all that said, how do you navigate an organization along the way? A lot of adaptation is what we've been able to do. But we've already trained well over 2,000 people in 3 to 4 years. So there's a lot of interest. We have, I think we have something like 5,000 calls a year. So lots of interest.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think people listening to the show, some of them might have heard of your trainings, and that's great. We're talking about the Integrative Psychiatry Institute, but what I'm fascinated about, and what I was fascinated years ago about your training was, you're doing this with the legal landscape being very challenging, and also you have trainings that are around nutrition, which I think is amazing. So where is this coming from? Like, you guys have had on your podcast amazing guests, right? You've had Gabor Mate, Peter Levine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Dick Schwartz, all these amazing people. So where are you getting this information? Is it your personal journeys that you're like, okay, we know that we want trainings for ketamine because it's helped us. We know that we need psychedelic-assisted therapy because it's helped us. But where is this nutritional training coming in? Where is that coming from?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Lifestyle medicine, like where are these coming from? I'm really curious.
Well, 7 years ago, when Will and I started the company, we were both got together and we're like, we just are not okay with the status quo of mental health care. We're not even okay with the status quo of psychotherapy either. Like it wasn't just medical care. It was also mental health care. It was just like we both saw in our own practices, and everyone we knew, we're friends with 100 therapists and psychiatrists, and everybody's got these people that just loop and don't get well. And then it's also like we were also just frustrated that it's not an optimization movement. It's a pathological model. So it's about treating disease, particularly psychiatry, more so than psychotherapy, but still in psychotherapy, especially in a lot of the public care. So we were like, we need to bring an integrative model that we had known. He was more going down the rabbit hole of functional medicine, but we both had been developing integrative care models, and we were like, let's start there. So we started with an integrative psychiatry fellowship. That's how the whole thing started. And that was to really move the needle in psychiatry, to bring more trauma awareness, to bring functional medicine, to get to the root causes of the disorders in the body, because we don't focus on root causes in mental health care medically in the body that much. It's a symptom reduction model mostly. And then it also, we have a whole kind of map, but you mentioned lifestyle medicine and nutrition and all of this. So we started there, but we also knew psychedelic therapy was on the radar. It just wasn't time in the first 7 years ago. It was a little too early for us to go there. And then within a few years from there, we started the psychedelic therapy training, which is definitely eclipsed all of our other work in terms of the energy and time that we're spending, in terms of really, we feel like it has the potential to make the biggest dent. And it's not for every client by any means, but it does have the potential, I think, to make the biggest dent. So that's kind of the course of how it all happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty remarkable if you're, someone who's been studying holistic health, who's went down the medication route, which I went down for 9 years and took an antidepressant, and had there, I was doing everything: biohacking, journaling, religion, everything I could, 12-step groups, still wasn't getting to the root of my trauma narratives and patterns that were just infiltrating my nervous system every day. Until I found some greater care. I found cold therapy in 2015 that started to help a little bit. But, it wasn't until I found psychedelic-assisted therapies that I really started getting to some very deep places, also very deep spiritual places. I'd always had faith. I'd always prayed and all that. I grew up in a really intense Christian household, and I sort of swore that off for a while too, as I went into the self-destructive mode. But as I came back and kind of built my own system of belief and integration, psychedelics are a big part of that too. Some of these bigger medicines and experiences, which are not for everyone, it can be completely destabilizing. These medicines, do
you feel like psychedelics was the biggest needle mover for you, or not necessarily?
I think the biggest needle mover for me was something holding space in a way that was consistent over time. Someone who could sit in a space and not edit or alter my story and let me just share authentically over a course of a long period of time. That had the biggest impact on my life by far. I was very fortunate to have two of those people over a course of 10 years. That was the biggest needle mover. After that, that influenced me becoming a helper, a healer, a counselor, all these things that I became, a coach. But what moved the needle the most with actually changing me fundamentally as a person was psychedelic-assisted therapy. Absolutely. Because I was so rigid in my 12-step thinking and my abstinent sobriety model for 15 years, all into that model, that the idea of taking a substance to alter my consciousness, even though we alter our consciousness every day in sleep, we alter our consciousness with caffeine and all these things. I just couldn't, with the rigidity of my thinking, believe that these types of, which I now call medicines, could be helpful. Some people call them drugs. Either way, could be that disruptive to the way that I still felt in my body each and every day. That was my baseline. my baseline changed when I started to integrate my psychedelic journeys. My baseline of who I am, hence where I moved to Costa Rica, changed because it somehow disrupted. I mean, I don't know how to say it. It disrupted something in my fascia. It disrupted something in my body, something in my brain that was so deep that it's never come back to those old depressive panic states of those intensities. Do I still have that disruption in my nervous system at time? Absolutely. And maybe that's enlightenment, right? When you fully hear your nervous system, maybe that's enlightenment. I don't know. But I think, yeah, it has had one of the biggest impacts besides someone holding deep empathetic space, which is what really where a lot of trauma can be helped and healed. But I think for the deeper stuff in the body, it was absolutely was certain psychedelics done, not recreational, and no knock to that, but it was done very therapeutically in containers that weren't perfect. But a lot of these ones now, I guess what I'm saying is I can advocate for myself now and know kind of the doses and the places that I want to go in these journeys. And before, when I first started, it was kind of like, I don't know what I'm doing. And I would do huge doses of these medicines, trusting the guides. And some of that was destabilizing for months. So I had to learn, it's like when you start any sport or any instrument, you got to learn to make some mistakes, hit the wrong chord.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to go back to one thing you said. I think it's an interesting thing to talk about. You said maybe the resolution of the nervous system to the full degree is enlightenment. You said maybe. Can we talk about that for a second?
Please, yeah.
It's a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's an interesting thing to talk about for any of the spiritually inclined listeners, which is, what is enlightenment? And then also, can we actually get to 100% resolution of our suffering is really what we're talking about, and of our trauma. I mean, maybe if we're at 100% resolution of our trauma, maybe we are at 100% relief, at least of some version of suffering. But one thing I want to say there is that I think that it seems possible from my subjectivity that people do get to what we call an enlightened state where they can actually completely stop the they can go to full thought cessation and emotional cessation where there's no longer spikes of emotional charges from memory, or if they happen, it's instantaneously goes away. I think that the enlightened person gets there. But what I'll say is that is not a social emotional path to living in the world. It's a different path. It's called a transcendent path. So I don't think, if you're going to stay in the social emotional engagement path where you're actually allowing yourself to have the experience of emotions and connecting with the emotions of others, and I don't think you get to 100% healing ever. I don't think that is I think that's not the social emotional path to get to. If you can't be at 100% healing in the social emotional path, is my opinion. I think what you're trying to do is live artfully in the social emotional path and get to an integrated experience with your memories of suffering, which means you're still going to cycle in and out of these pains, but they will integrate more and more over time so that they don't rule you, right? I just think these are two different paths personally. I don't think I think there's a spectrum where they can coexist, but not when we talk enlightenment, full transcendence, the full, highest level samadhi states. I think that's something else where you're actually transcending the social emotional engagement system to some degree.
Yeah, fascinating. I'm glad we went there.
Yeah.
That's I know feel what you're stepping in. And I think that there's parts of me at times when I do have these beautiful, moments where I feel like, oh, wow, there is 100% healing for the nervous system possible when I have those, because I can feel it in my body. I can feel it in my mind. I can feel it in my spirit. I feel like those are times when I have those where I go, hey, you know what? I'm going to go 100% into the enlightenment path of serving medicine and just being down this. But then, I do come back to, my baseline again. And then I feel like, no, you know what? This Entrepreneurs Recovery podcast will continue. These things will continue, coaching and speaking at times and writing. And yeah, it's a very interesting discussion. And, fortunately, to even have this discussion is really an honor, because I'm having this discussion with you because I've been to those places of very big experiences and been completely in this state of like, thank you, like just a gratitude,
Right, gratitude
beyond anything I've ever experienced.
Yeah.
And
Well, the cool thing you're talking about too is like, psychedelic. Let's just talk about psychedelic therapy. Like, you actually can have these windows into that enlightened experience. Enlightenment is, talked about as a static experience. It doesn't change it anymore. But like, you actually can have a window into that level of freedom. And that's an amazing thing. I mean, that's some of in the research, having these experiences of, oneness, where, all space and time collapse, and that changes us in a positive way. That actually integrates. So whether you're going after it for indefinite, some kind of indefinite experience of enlightenment, or you just get to have these windows that integrate. I mean, I think it's a pretty profound thing, having the experiences, because and that happens in meditation too. It's just a lot more work to get there. In meditation, it's a lot more hours, I should say. Maybe not more work. It's a lot more hours to access those states.
so, yeah, I have kind of two destinations coming up in my head that I'd like to go with you. But one is, we'll go to this first, see where this goes. But I want to come back to the second one, which is around business. But before we go there, since a lot of the path I've been on is about addiction, mental health, what have you found with your trainings, with your, running a clinic and your personal experiences around psychedelic-assisted therapies and addiction? Are they helpful? What have you found? Has there been a lot of success and breakthroughs in that field that you've seen?
I would say that with the where we currently are in terms of psychedelic therapy above ground, intense substance abuse addictions hasn't been a focus of treatment, generally speaking. And that's because I think of a few things. I mean, for one, ketamine therapy, there's some very small studies out there looking at that. But again, it hasn't been a focus, right? And it depends on what we're talking about, what addiction. But I think that there's a lot of use, particularly it could be in the sense of a breakthrough to stop, to get to an abstinence experience. It could be there. And then, of course, we see more of that in like ibogaine. And then you have like a center in Peru that is using ayahuasca for addiction. So there's that too. But I would say the main way it's integrating right now has not been addiction. But I think it's actually pretty useful for people in recovery to go deeper in their recovery process, because it doesn't there's always the vulnerability of going back to the substance of choice that you were using. But generally speaking, a psychedelic therapy session, I don't think causes that. So I think it's got some potential there. And I've definitely seen people doing that for that reason. But I would say, generally speaking, it's being used right now. Again, above ground, we're talking ketamine mostly, depression, trauma, some anxiety. And then more on the outskirts would be addiction.
Yeah, you hinted and touched towards people already in recovery, which was me, and choosing after 15 years completely turned my life around. Why would I ever do psychedelics? And I bumped into a guy named Dr. Dan Engel, and I asked him the question: why would someone with 20 years or 30 years of recovery abstinence, why would they do psychedelics? And he looked at me really strange. He's like, well, why wouldn't they? Aren't part of the steps and the processes to engage with a higher power, a God or whatever. And so he said, to increase your intuition, to go into deeper places of spiritual fulfillment. And it kind of struck me like, yeah, I guess that makes sense. And then it would take me 4 years later before I would engage in psychedelic therapies. But yeah, I think that's often something that's not researched very much or talked about, but long-term recovery, people in long-term abstinent recovery. And I mean from like sex addiction, drugs and alcohol, all of it, to engage in psychedelics in a way that could help to expand their spiritual life, their intuition. Because what I find is a lot of people are not happy and fulfilled, no matter how much time they have in recovery. And it takes people to hear a podcast like this with your journey as an entrepreneur, which I want to get into, or mine, where they get really curious of like, look at the state of the world right now. There's tons of jobs being laid off. There's tons of positions going away, even in SAMHSA, which is, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. These are important positions, serving recovery, vanishing. So with that said, it looks like solopreneurship and entrepreneurship is really starting to look attractive for a lot of people. And so with that said, I'm curious with your path of solopreneurship and the lessons you've learned. And you guys are, like you said, leading a healthcare revolution in what you're doing. Like, what are some of the lessons? Like, why become a solopreneur? Why did you go that path? What were some of the reasons that led you that direction?
I mean, I wanted to work for myself was one. Let me think about this. So solopreneur. So now I'm more kind of technically an entrepreneur, but when I was in my private practice, I went into it. I mean, I went into it as a healer, and I didn't want to work for other people, and I couldn't make enough money working for other people, and I wanted to work with the clientele that I wanted to work with. So as a healer, being a solopreneur, if you feel like you're designed to run a small business like that, it made a lot of sense to me because I wanted to work with certain clients. I didn't want to work in a public system. I did some of that, but I didn't want to stay there because I just wanted to work the ways I wanted to work. I wanted to have more control over my time. I wanted to make more money than I was making in the public sector. So it was all the above. And not everyone's cut out to be a solopreneur, entrepreneur, but yeah, I think if we get outside of just mental health care, it is a good thing to consider over, the future here. Is entrepreneurship's not going away, but jobs are going away. So that is something to consider. Jobs are definitely going away, but being able to create your own business is not going away.
Yeah, and I mean, they're not just going away. The jobs are not just going away because of the current administration. They're going away because of AI, and that's part of it. So
that's what I was talking about.
Yeah, we're already in this like incredible moment in history where we can really see it happening now, and you can watch the macro markets crumbling, and there's some are actually going up, which is interesting. But I think like when you think about where we're heading and what's coming, especially with AI, like what impact do you think that's going to have on the psychedelic industry, which you're deeply embedded in? So what kind of impact do you think? Are more people going to come to psychedelics during this time because of what's happening in this great transition? What do you see happening?
I think more people are going to turn toward needing understanding. I think more and more people are going to feel confused and overwhelmed in their confusion. I mean, that's already happening. So I think that we're going to keep seeing an increase in mental health issues, which we are. I think we're going to keep seeing an increase in confusion. Again, I'm just talking generalities. And I think we're going to see more and more people turning away from the typical ways we get answers, that we're sort of raised with, to say, okay, where do you go get an answer when you have a meaning issue or when you have a physical issue? Or I think people are more and more, I mean, if we talk about AI, it's like people are going to be willing to be more creative in how they get their answers. And I think psychedelic therapy will become more important over time as a tool. It's still a young tool in a certain way. I mean, it's not precise. It's in terms of like, it's sort of a gross tool in terms of like, you don't know what you're going to get. It's not super precise. You can't be like, I'm going to work on this thing and that's what I'm going to work on. Well, you may sort of work on it, but you also might be working on 99 other things and maybe 1% that thing. So it's not a precise tool yet in terms of what we will have one day. We will have more and more precise tools, and they may be medicines. They may be in the psychedelic category that gets engineered. I don't know. There'll probably be other things. So I think, yes, I think the need will increase. I think we're going to, as we keep polarizing in our, we're in a war of ideologies now, particularly in the United States, but also in many other countries, where people are polarizing and getting more rigid ideologies right now. Ideologies are getting rigidified. And that ends up creating confusion over time, not integration. So we will enter a period where we need more and more tools to help us. For the people that start to loosen the rigidity, right? If you stay too rigid, you're there, you're not moving. But a lot of people seek to break out of rigidity.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about like the 60s and 70s and the people doing massive amounts of LSD, and they're like, oh, we're going to go into the golden age. We're going to dose the whole world with LSD. We're going to bring in this golden age, only to get crushed by the war on drugs and get crushed by all the things that would come. I'm curious, like, in some ways, are we redoing those times in a better way, like in a more structured way now, where we're like, okay, we're learning from our mistakes, or are we going back to some crazy chaos? Or I feel like it's more structured now. What's happening with, let's call it the psychedelic renaissance that's happening. How do you? What are your feelings around that?
Well, I think that's a great thing you're bringing up. I mean, I think that it's a little complex. The 60s had a cultural movement happening alongside of psychedelics that were related and unrelated. So there was sort of a cultural entanglement in the exploration of psychedelics at the time. So because of that, a lot of stigmas got coupled to psychedelics. And we weren't doing for the masses who were doing this, it wasn't psychedelic therapy, right? It was often being done in music environments or whatever it was. But the set and setting introduced a lot of chaotic conditions. So there's a lot more stories of when we do this, and this is why my whole thing is around psychedelic therapy, because I believe in it. I think there's you can introduce a lot of things that can either harm you or, you get traumatized in other settings with psychedelics. That can happen. I'm not saying I necessarily believe in, the war on drugs. as a mechanism to deal with that. But I think that there are some real risks there for people when they're using them recreationally or just even exploration, but without a good container. So, yeah, I think we're doing it differently with the psychedelic therapy movement. But, a lot of people are using psychedelics now, if you look at the research outside of psychedelic therapy. But it's not entangled in the same cultural movement that was happening at the time. So I don't think it's going to sort of mirror or be the same thing that happened then. I think this is a different time. And now we have this rising of let's also explore this in a really good container, healthy container. So I think it's very different. But I do think we have a extreme ideological polarization happening again. That was happening in the 60s in some way. These go in cycles, these ideological polarizations. This happens throughout history. Every nation, every culture does this, large cultures. So we are there again, where there's a clash of ideologies. So we don't know where that's going. We don't know how that ends. Typically, polarization leads to a lot of violence. So let's see. Hopefully not, but that's typically how it goes.
So I just had this really crazy thought, but your company are you preparing for having virtual reality goggles so that when people do ketamine-assisted therapy, the therapist is in your goggles, and then you're having is this where we're going? Or we're going to be wearing goggles and we're going to be taking our at-home ketamine or whatever happens over the legal landscape over the next couple of years? Are you guys going to be prepared for trainings and virtual reality psychedelic trips?
We're not preparing for that because will that happen one day? Probably. We're not preparing for it because there's going to have to be an integration first, technologically and culturally, for that to become more mainstream anyways, where people are really using VR that way, because that hasn't really taken off that way yet fully, but that will be one day. I think some things have to happen in the tech for that to integrate into society, like the PC integrated into society. It's not integrating like that yet. Partly the tech is still kind of clunky and big, and that's one issue. And I think there's others of why it hasn't integrated yet fully, but that's going to happen. I have no doubt that we will see. There's a downside to all that. There's an upside, but there's a downside, which is then you don't have physical social contact, and that is a big downside. But there's an upside too. I think that's coming. That level of integration society, I think people thought it was going to be here by now, that level of integration, and it's just not yet. But will it be here in 10 years from now or 20? Probably. I think so.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's exciting to talk to you about it because obviously your trainings keep expanding. When I found you a couple years ago, there was a certain amount of trainings. Now you have all these other trainings that are coming out, and I see you as an entrepreneur looking at the landscape and saying, let's bring out this training. Let's bring out this training. So, keeping your pulse to the dial of what's happening in your market. And you're really like, okay, this is what's happening. This is what we're going to offer. And also we've done it ourselves. And I think that's integral. And that's what I really appreciate you coming on the show is there's integrity, and I can go back and watch you guys years ago talk about this stuff and all the way into today. And so I really appreciate that integrity.
Yeah. I mean, I went down a little rabbit hole around VR and healing, not psychedelics per se, but just like, there's a research. We interviewed a researcher, Emery, maybe, I can't remember. I think her name's Rothbaum. I can't remember her exact name. That might be it. She's like the leading VR researcher for therapy. Anyways, the tech is still not, there's a concept of like, well, what happens when the tech is indistinguishable and you can actually, as a therapist, you create a whole scene from childhood and go in there. Everything looks real. You're in there as a resource and you program everything in and you start working through things, right? Like, that type of tech is coming. That was in one of the Iron Man movies. I don't know if you remember this. Tony Stark's on stage talking about this, working through your trauma and like virtual reality. So this is coming. This isn't, but it's still a little ways away, but it's not that far away. We probably needed AI for this level of tech. So that'll be here one day. It's not here yet. We're not focused on it, but I think it actually will. I think VR will actually be an incredible resource eventually in the therapy space, like much more than it ever has been.
Yeah, one of the reasons too I'm so curious about this is I was on X, formerly known as Twitter, and there's an AI component called Grok 2, and you can ask it questions like ChatGPT. And I asked it to roast me as a solopreneur, and it hurt bad. Like it roasted me in ways that I was like, that's like psychologically damaging. It was so spot on. What it did, it went through all of the information I had on X, all the information about me and my books and my podcast, and it roasted me hard. Like it was like, you're selfish because of these reasons, because you just, and it's like, wow. And so that's how, I don't think people realize where we are today with AI and how powerful it already is. And so,
I use AI. I mean, in terms of like AI therapists, it's really far along. If you just want like a technical answer, psychodynamic theory, existential theory, Jungian, any of that, you'll get a technical answer that'll mirror anything any therapist can say to you, if you plug it in enough times. That's where we're at. So like we are there where like you can actually have a therapy session with AI. Is that going to heal people in the same way with the social emotional engagement system online? I don't think so. But is it a tool that will heal people in a different way that humans can? Yes, because eventually you're going to plug in enough data points and get information there you're just not going to be able to get with a therapist.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious. This is a fascinating discussion to go to some of these places you can't always go to with people. So I'm really grateful we could go there.
Yeah. I like talking about this stuff. It's fun. And it's also like, we better talk about it because
relevant.
We're here. It's happening now.
Yeah.
And like, if you're not thinking ahead, first of all, you get left behind, which is a problem. If you're not thinking ahead just a little bit, you can get left behind here as a healer, any profession, but even as a healer, you don't want to get left behind.
Right. Yeah, especially like if you're an entrepreneur, especially a solopreneur, and you don't have a team. Like when I had Psychedelics today on the podcast, Joe and Kyle, I said to them, because everyone's looking to raise funds and capital and money, and I was like, well, have you guys thought about launching a cryptocurrency? And they hadn't, and they were like, wow. And so in the episode, my brain, their brain, and it was like, so the point is that we need each other, we need to talk to each other, and we can brainstorm these ideas, because overnight something can change. Something can change and your market is disrupted. Look at COVID, look at these things that have happened. So I think it's always good to be prepared, talking about psychedelics. It's here to stay. I don't care what area you're in, addiction, mental health, all of it, it's here. And even just optimization, it's here. So these discussions are why I exist. And, and so I'm curious, what's the vision you're bringing to life that you're most excited about right now? What are you most excited about bringing to life?
We're working on book, Will and I, on psychedelic therapy. So that's exciting. Shambhala Publications. It'll be out exactly a year from now. So that's cool.
Yeah. Congrats.
And, we bring in different elements, like the things we're talking about, just some of the integrative things and underlying issues and what it's for, what it's not for. So that'll be exciting. So that's a good portion of my time. I have a 1-year-old and a 6-year-old, so that's another good portion of my time with my family. I'm excited about, I have a lot of creative things I want to do still, so we'll see where I go with that. But for right now, I think the book is the biggest project.
Yeah, that's a big one. That's a big project, the book. I definitely want to have you back on. Maybe we can promote your book during the publication time.
Great.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating discussion. And let's let the listeners know like where they can find you, where they can find your trainings and your podcasts and all the things you're doing in the world.
So psychiatryinstitute.com is our institute, and there's a lot of stuff on there, and our podcast is on there, and our training is on there. So that I would say that's the best place to go. I mean, our podcast is the Higher Practice Podcast. We're busy, so we kind of come and go in terms of doing episodes, but it's definitely got a good library of cool stuff in it to check out. I would say those are the two main things to check out: psychiatryinstitute.com and the Higher Practice Podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Keith, for coming on the show. It's been fascinating to get to meet you for the first time.
Thanks.
Let's keep it going.
Good.
And
awesome.
I appreciate
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Cool. Anytime.
Thanks.
Thank you for checking out Entrepreneurs of Recovery podcast. We are so appreciative that you are here. Make sure you go ahead and like and subscribe to the show on YouTube. Leave a review on iTunes and Spotify so more people can find the show. Once again, thank you so much. We have great episodes and content come out in the future. Thank you for being here. Have a blessed day.